The grand conclave chamber of the Cathar Imperium was not built for comfort or warmth, but for the profound, chilling clarity of universal truth. Its ceiling, a vault of polished obsidian, drew down the faint, scattered light of distant nebulae, a stark, cold mirror to the void they now discussed. The air, thin and electrically charged, resonated only with the low, harmonic thrum of the immense, silent power generators buried kilometers below the planetary crust. A sound that always spoke of control, of absolute, millennia-old stability. Yet tonight, that thrum was an unstable vibration beneath the seven-jointed appendages of the conclave prime, Hierarch Sarth, whose primary visual receptors were fixed, not on the assembled dignitaries, but on the holographic projection shimmering at the chamber's absolute center. It was a projection of nothing, an absence of light and matter, a swirling vortex of cosmological negation designated only by the chillingly detached nomenclature, the rift shadow. This was the dangerous that had arisen, an emergent phenomenon whose statistical probability had been zero until it had simply been. Hierarch Sarth's voice, filtered through the chamber's resonant modifiers, was a low, gravelly current, betraying the seismic tremor of the political and existential fear that gripped the ancient Imperium. The data remains consistent, Archstatistician Dren. The consumption rate accelerates. It is not moving, it is expanding. And our most sophisticated probabilistic models continue to reject the possibility of its existence. It is a paradox manifested, a contradiction made physical. A hole in the weave of reality, yet it consumes systems, not fleets, not planets, but the very space in which those objects reside. And now, Sarth paused, the silence stretching into an unbearable length, forcing every member of the conclave to feel the weight of their species, entire history pressing down upon them. We must address the response of the fringe entities, specifically the Terran species. Archstatistician Dren, a smaller Cathar whose carapace was etched with the dense filigree of complex calculation matrices, shifted slightly, a movement of deep, intellectual unease. Hierarch, the Terran data stream is confusing. Their response to the proximal threat of the rift shadow is entirely disproportionate to their current station in the galactic order. While the Coalition and the Synodic worlds have logically diverted a fraction of their industrial capacity to bolstering existing defenses, a rational, measured response predicated on a statistically low chance of direct, near-future impact, the Terrans have enacted a near-total societal pivot. Their industrial output, tracked across all key orbital and planetary manufacturing centers, has spiked to levels previously only associated with species-level survival events. The data indicates an obsessive, singular focus on the construction of military assets. Specifically, warships. The scale is unprecedented for a species of their technological and political maturity. A secondary hologram snapped into existence beside the swirling negation of the rift shadow. It was a crude, segmented representation of the Terran manufacturing output charts, a vertical line that climbed with a brutal, sickening urgency, a stark contrast to the gently sloping, measured curves of the other advanced species. Prime Strategist Vale, whose lineage traced back to the conclave that first charted the Great Drift millennia ago, projected his disbelief. Disproportionate is an understatement, Dren. It is a catastrophic miscalculation, a panic-fueled resource drain. What possible strategic benefit can they derive from diverting the entirety of their limited resources into a military buildup? Against what? The shadow is not a conventional enemy. It is a void, and no fleet, no matter how vast, can fire upon nothingness. This is the behavior of an unstable entity, Hierarch, fear, untethered by logic breeding desperation. They are constructing a weapon based on a deeply flawed, emotionally driven premise. The premise that a massive wall of kinetic force can halt the dissolution of the cosmos. The political undercurrents of the chamber shifted. The Cathar Imperium viewed logic as the ultimate moral and strategic force. Any action driven by raw, uncontained emotion, particularly fear, was seen as not only inefficient but morally suspect, a potential source of galactic instability far more immediate than a distant cosmological anomaly. Fear, in the Cathar political lexicon, meant unpredictability. And unpredictability, especially when armed on this scale, was a contagious disease they could not permit to spread. Unstable veil, yes, Hierarch Sarth conceded, the deep folds around his primary optics tightening. But we must look past the emotional driver and analyze the output. If this frenzied construction is indeed motivated by pure, raw fear, what does that imply for their scent? Rachik application of the resulting assets. A species driven to such extremes of panic manufacture will inevitably seek to externalize that fear, to project that instability. They could attempt a preemptive military acquisition of safer territories, sparking a localized conflict with the coalition. Or worse, they could attempt to leverage this nascent, panic-built fleet against us, the established powers, out of a desperate, ill-conceived demand for protection or resources. Sarth's voice dropped, its volume now a deliberate whisper that nevertheless filled the immense space, amplifying the profound political gravity of his suspicion. The question is not what the shadow will do. The question is what a species, building a catastrophic number of warships out of fear, will do with that power once it is realized. The debate stretched, the long, measured paragraphs of Cathar logic weaving a complex tapestry of suspicion and apprehension. They analyzed the design schematics gleaned from the Terran network fringes. The vessels were heavily armored, designed for prolonged operational capacity, but lacked the characteristic offensive missile arrays or sophisticated energy projection systems favored by the Imperium's doctrine. They seemed to be built for endurance, for taking punishment, for long, agonizing journeys into deep, hostile space, not for swift, decisive combat. This only deepened the mystery. Why build something so resilient if the strategy was, as they suspected, an irrational, panic-fueled lunge for immediate safety? An efficient, aggressive fleet would prioritize speed and overwhelming firepower. These human vessels, these warships of fear, were clumsy, powerful, and strangely defensive in their core architecture. Archivist Lyra, whose role was to contextualize current events within the vast, cold history of the Imperium, finally spoke, her voice a precise, clinical counterpoint to the rising political anxiety. Hierarch, there is a historical parallel, albeit a minor one. The Terrans experienced an internal conflict on a planetary scale several centuries ago, their Cold War. Our psychological analysts at the time noted a peculiar phenomenon. Their greatest technological and defensive leaps were often made not out of a desire for conquest or superiority, but out of a profound, collective anxiety regarding an enemy's potential capability. Their fear of what could happen drove a paradoxical stability, the concept of mutually assured destruction, an inherently terrifying but ultimately self-regulating mechanism. This current military construction appears to be a hyper-accelerated iteration of that ancient internal defense mechanism. They are building a self-regulating defense against the ultimate potential enemy, the cosmic unknown. But the scale of this reaction, it suggests a level of internal analysis, a terror of calculation that we have not yet adequately accounted for. Lyra trailed off, her visual sensors focusing on the unsettlingly smooth ascent of the Terran manufacturing curve. They are afraid, but their fear, unlike ours, appears to be a prodigious systematic engine, not a collapse. After what felt like cycles, Hierarch Sarth brought the agonizing, dense debate to a close. The political risk of an armed, fearful, and unpredictable entity operating on the fringes of the major powers was deemed greater than the direct, distant risk of the Rift Shadow. A diplomatic solution, or failing that, a managed containment was required. The official Imperium position, the Terran reaction constituted a destabilizing force and an unmeasured threat to the galactic political equilibrium. The resolution was drafted, a high-level diplomatic mission, led by Sarth's most trusted and formidable envoy, accompanied by a modest but unmistakably powerful escort fleet. Not for war, but for the projection of absolute necessary control. The mission's objective: secure an immediate, verifiable halt to the Warships of Fear project, or face the logical, inevitable consequences of the Imperium's superior rational force. The fear that haunted the conclave was not for the galaxy's stability against the shadow, but for its stability against the overwhelming, self-generated terror of the Terran species itself. The transition from the grand, cold geometry of Cathar space to the Terran neutral zone was a descent into an unsettling, vibrant chaos. Kalen Var, the Cathar envoy, a being of immense political and strategic weight, felt the shift immediately. His vessel, the Logic Ascendant, a dagger of black, seamless alloy, hung at the boundary, surrounded by its escort, a small but potent representation of the Imperium's calm strength. The Terran zone was a dizzying, disorganized nexus of commercial traffic, research stations, and most disturbingly, orbital construction yards that pulsed with an almost frantic energy. There was no grand, ordered defensive perimeter, no elegant choke point. None of the logical symmetry the Cathar applied to their borders. It was a sprawling, industrious mess, reflecting the very nature they suspected of the species: powerful, prolific, and utterly without internal cohesion or rational design. Var initiated the high-priority diplomatic channel. The silence that followed was long, dense, and unnerving. In the Imperium, a delay of this magnitude would signal either a deliberate act of contempt or a catastrophic failure of infrastructure. With the Terrans, Var suspected it was simply bureaucratic inefficiency wrapped in technological arrogance. Finally, a response materialized, not as a complex, modulated Cathar waveform, but as a simple, high-fidelity audiovisual feed. The human on the screen was designated Ambassador Alara Chen. She was still, calm, and utterly lacking in the traditional diplomatic posturing and ceremonial garb that signified power and respect across the known galaxy. Her expression was devoid of aggression, anxiety, or even curiosity, a disconcerting neutrality that Var's psychological algorithms struggled to process. Her voice, when it came, was measured, low, and resonant with a strange, compelling confidence. "Envoy Kalen Var of the Cathar Imperium," she began, the address perfectly modulated, betraying no haste. "Your presence was anticipated. We acknowledge the profound political and strategic concern that drove your journey. We are prepared to receive your delegation immediately at our primary deep space station, the constancy of watchfulness. Be advised, the construction efforts you observe are critical and ongoing. Standard docking procedures will be automated." Var felt a spike of calculated offense. To be met by an automated welcome system, to be told that their arrival was an interruption to ongoing, critical efforts, was a deliberate slight, or again, a profound cultural misunderstanding. He chose the measured political response. "Ambassador Chen," Var projected, his voice precisely controlled to convey absolute seriousness without aggression. "My mission is one of necessary inquiry and, potentially, strategic negotiation. The magnitude of the military construction currently dominating Terran industrial capacity is a profound concern to the established galactic order. It is seen as a destabilizing factor in the face of the emerging threat of the Rift Shadow. We require immediate clarity on the operational purpose of this immense fleet, particularly given the unprecedented scale of production, and an understanding of the strategic calculus that overrides all other internal priorities. Why this sudden, total pivot to a defensive military posture, and what is the true nature of the fear driving this output?" Ambassador Chen did not flinch, did not shift her posture, did not even seem to acknowledge the implicit threat in Var's tone. She merely waited until the final syllable had dissipated in the command bridge of the logic ascendant, and then responded with a succinctness that was almost brutal in its calm efficiency. "Envoy Var, the rationale is simple and was calculated to the highest degree of probability. We observed the statistical trajectory of the Rift Shadow. We did not panic. We calculated. We determined, with a certainty higher than 99.9%, that while the immediate threat to the established powers remains low, the probability of the Shadow's eventual, total consumption of all matter within its expansion radius trends toward absolute certainty over cosmic timescales. Our defensive effort is driven by one calculation. The protection of the species is a mathematical imperative. The method is the only variable. As for the nature of the fear you perceive, I will clarify this for your conclave directly. Our fear is not of a localized military defeat, but of the loss of potential. The loss of all accumulated knowledge, all future thought, all possibility of contribution to the universal tapestry. That is the only fear that justifies a total defense. We look forward to elaborating on this calculus during our physical meeting." The sheer, unadorned logic of her statement, stripped bare of any political adornment, landed heavily on Var. She had taken the raw emotional concept of fear and transformed it into a purely objective mathematical driver for total industrial mobilization. The Cathar, who prided themselves on logic, were now confronted with a logic so absolute, so uncompromising, that it verged on the philosophical. The human concept of loss of potential as the ultimate threat was a stunning revelation. The Cathar feared loss of control, the Terrans feared the loss of everything. Var proceeded to the deep space station, the constancy of watchfulness, an edifice of dark, rough-hewn composite materials that lacked the sleek, polished elegance of Cathar architecture. It was purely functional, a fortress that looked less like a home and more like an immensely powerful industria. El Organ, the docking procedure was silent, automated, and unnervingly precise. The meeting room was Spartan, dominated by a single, expansive holographic display projecting an incomprehensibly complex kinetic simulation. When Ambassador Chen entered, she was accompanied by a single, tall figure, a specialist, identified only as Chief Analytical Engineer Dr. Aris Thorne. Var began the exchange, his carefully constructed opening statements about galactic stability and the necessity of rational military output now feeling cumbersome and archaic. Ambassador Chen, Dr. Thorne, let us move past the philosophical debate and examine the tangible output. We have analyzed the schematics of your emerging fleet. Your vessels are heavily armored, over-engineered for resilience, and possess weapon systems that appear optimized for area denial and structural integrity testing, not tactical engagement. They are, forgive the directness, inefficient combat platforms. They are built to absorb, not to strike. Dr. Thorne, silent until now, nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the holographic display, which showed the Rift Shadow's chaotic expansion enveloping a small star cluster. Envoy Var, your assessment is correct, but the premise is flawed. You evaluate them as combat platforms against a conventional, sentient enemy. They are not. They are life support systems optimized for extreme duration in a hostile, non-sentient environment. The Cathar, and indeed the entire coalition, design vessels for engagement cycles measured in hours or days. We have designed vessels for operational cycles measured in decades, potentially centuries. He then initiated a new simulation on the central display. It showed a projected pathway of the Rift Shadow impacting a dense region of space. The simulated Cathar defense forces, represented by elegant, powerful-looking vectors, engaged with the periphery of the shadow, firing powerful energy beams. The energy was simply consumed, absorbed, or dissipated. The Cathar vessels, lacking the necessary protective shielding against the shadow's consuming force, were quickly deleted from the simulation. Then the Terran vessels appeared. They moved not to engage the shadow, but to evacuate a section of the simulated star system, forming a dense, self-reinforcing wall. They did not fire upon the shadow. Instead, they projected dense, short-range gravitometric fields and sustained low-level distortion pulses. They were not trying to fight the void. They were trying to generate a temporary, localized, non-contiguous pocket of space-time stability adjacent to the void's consuming edge. Our warships, Ambassador Chen stated, her voice utterly calm, are not designed to defeat the shadow. They are designed to hold the line long enough for a strategic retreat, or in the inevitable scenario of attrition, to ensure that the vital data, the accumulated knowledge, and the core genetic material of our species can be transferred to a distant, safer location before the vessel itself is lost. We are building massive, self-sustaining, mobile arcs of knowledge and life, armored not against kinetic impact, but against the long, slow, agonizing physics of cosmological decay. Their inefficiency in conventional combat is a calculated trade-off for their near-absolute resilience in deep space operations. The large-scale reveal of the Terran strategy was a devastating intellectual blow to Var. It wasn't incompetence or panic or instability. It was a strategy of such long-term, cold-blooded resignation to an inevitable universal truth, the eventual triumph of entropic forces, that it dwarfed the Cathar's own measured political responses. The Cathar had been preparing to fight a war. The Terrans were preparing for an exodus or a millennia-long siege against a force of nature. Their fear was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate sign of rational, statistical commitment to the survival of potential. You are building arcs, Var stated, the concept heavy on his vocal filters. But arcs of this magnitude require a resource outlay that will cripple your internal economy. It is a sacrifice of the present for a statistical chance at an unreachable future. That is the definition of desperation. Dr. Thorne counterprojected a new set of data, the human resource flow. The economy is not crippled, Envoy. It is retasked. We have simply redefined the concept of investment. Investment is no longer measured in consumer comfort or short-term political gain, but in the probability of long-term species continuity. Furthermore, the ships are not merely arcs. They are also, necessarily, manufacturing and recycling platforms. The very structure of the ship is a closed-loop refinery and construction facility. The only way to build a fleet of this scale, dedicated to centuries of operation, is to design each vessel to be a sovereign, self-sustaining industrial unit. Every piece of armor, every component, is built with a lifespan, and far exceeding any current galactic standard. Our current build rate is not simply adding ships. It is adding factories that will, in turn, construct the next generation of resilient hardware. The fear that drove us was not a sudden, panicked sprint. It was a cold, hard marathon decision made at the highest level of our shared governance. We are building warships out of fear, yes, but that fear is the calculated terror of inactivity. Ambassador Chen stepped forward, her gaze meeting Var's directly. The Cathar Imperium and the Coalition are debating how to minimize the immediate political fallout. We are debating how to maximize the probability of our descendants enduring the ultimate cosmic silence. Your political calculus is based on the next century. Ours is based on the next 100,000 years. And that, she said, with the simple, devastating authority of absolute conviction, is why the scale of our production is so immense. We are building enough redundancy to weather a statistical impossibility. The weight of this cultural and strategic contrast settled upon Envoy Var with the force of a collapsing star. The human fear was a disciplined, high-velocity engine of rational survival, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of cosmic reality that the established powers had chosen to ignore or minimize. They had underestimated the Terrans not because of their lack of firepower, but because of the unexpected depth and ethical gravity of their fear. The human race, in the face of an existential, non-sentient threat, had chosen to abandon petty conflicts and political short-sightedness, and instead to focus with terrifying, quiet professionalism on the singular, immense task of perpetuating life and knowledge. Envoy Kalen Var returned to the Cathar Grand Conclave with the full, unfiltered projection of the Terran analysis. The chamber, once a bastion of political maneuver and logical superiority, became a silent theater of profound, collective shame and intellectual shock. The scale of the Terran data, the complexity of their long-term survivability models, and the sheer ethical purity of their sacrifice shattered the prevailing narrative of Terran instability. The warships of fear were not weapons of aggression. They were vessels of unparalleled, rational responsibility. Hierarch Sarth, presiding over the subsequent session, was visibly altered. The certainty in his bearing had been replaced by a heavy, meditative introspection. He reviewed the Terran projected attrition rates, the acceptance of inevitable, massive loss, and their commitment to an operational timeline that stretched beyond the Imperium's entire recorded history. "We misjudged the core driver," Sarth admitted, his voice now stripped of its formal filter, raw and low in the enormous chamber. "We interpreted their fear as panic, as a failure of logic. They in turn utilized that fear as a precise mathematical constant. Their fear is what permitted them to make the ultimate, cold, ethical decision, to accept the loss of the present for the preservation of the future. While we debated the political cost of deployment, they were calculating the material requirements for the survival of consciousness itself, beyond the event horizon of the Shadow's consumption. They did not just build warships, Conclave. They built the infrastructure of continuity." The political friction that had dominated the chamber evaporated, replaced by a deep, shared philosophical realization. The Cathar Imperium, built on the dogma of absolute logic, was forced to confront the fact that true, profound logic sometimes required the embrace of an emotion they had always dismissed, a fear so complete it necessitated a total, selfless commitment. The subsequent diplomatic process was not a negotiation, but a quiet, rapid-fire integration. The Terrans, through Ambassador Chen and Dr. Thorne, did not demand concessions. They offered data, shared their entire, complex analysis, and provided the schematics for their highly resilient structural alloys and closed-loop life support systems. The Cathar, with their superior fundamental physics knowledge, quickly integrated this data, realizing that a combined, shared effort was now the only rational option. The warships of fear became the foundation for the new, unified galactic defense survival fleet. The Imperium began the painful, humbling process of retooling its own vast, powerful, but ultimately short-sighted industrial base to mimic the Terran model of extreme-duration resilience. The alliance was formalized not with grand treaties, but with the simple, shared exchange of engineering specifications and survivability checklists. Terran design philosophy, resilience over firepower, resource independence over political reliance, became the standard. The quiet, powerful presence of the human analysts and engineers, calm under the ultimate cosmic pressure, was the most profound revelation to the Cathar. They were not aggressive, not arrogant, but simply professional, hyper-competent, and profoundly protective of life and knowledge. Then came the new data, an anomaly in the Terran models that had, up until the integration of Cathar deep sensor systems, been dismissed as background noise. Dr. Aris Thorne brought the new finding to a joint crisis council, now meeting on the constancy of watchfulness. The Rift Shadow's trajectory is chaotic, but its expansion follows a discernible path of least resistance through the gravitational fields of the interstellar medium, Thorne explained, pointing to a new overlay on the tactical projection. We have been calculating its path based on maximizing consumption of local baryonic matter. That assumption was incomplete. When factoring in the Cathar's detailed dark matter mapping, we discovered a terrifying alignment. The trajectory projection stabilized. The Shadow's consumption path, refined by the new data, was aimed not at any major galactic population center, but directly toward a location of profound, legendary significance, the Cradle of Whispers. This was a deep void region, home to the largest and most ancient known abandoned structure in the galaxy, a colossal artificial nexus of unfathomable age, believed to have been constructed by the fabled progenitors who had vanished eons ago. No one knew its purpose. It was studied, revered, and considered an untouchable cosmic relic. The Shadow will reach the outer field of the cradle within a Terran century, Thorne continued, his voice steady despite the enormity of the statement. It will not consume it instantly, but the Shadow's interaction with the exotic materials and the sheer incomprehensible mass of the cradle will create a phenomenon we have designated the resonance cascade. We believe the progenitors did not simply build a structure. They built a receiver, a transmitter, or perhaps a lock. The Shadow's presence will not just destroy the cradle, it will silence it, forever. Ambassador Chen took the narrative from the engineer. Envoy Var Hierarch Sarth, we can defend our home systems. The combined Terran and Cathar fleet built for resilience and extreme duration will ensure the survival of our species. But the Cradle of Whispers is something else. Our initial analysis, the fear that drove our total mobilization, was not simply the fear of losing ourselves. It was the fear of losing this. The human race in its short history has always been driven by the absolute imperative to find out why. Why are we here? Why did the progenitors vanish? The cradle is the potential answer. It is the key to the deepest knowledge in the galaxy. The Shadow is not just consuming matter. It is erasing the history and purpose of the cosmos. The final, staggering twist had been revealed. The human fear that had mystified and terrified the Cathar was not just species-level self-preservation. It was a profound, ethical, almost religious fear of the loss of universal truth. They had built their colossal, resilient fleet of warships of fear, not just to survive, but to launch an operation of unimaginable audacity. A mission to defend, stabilize, and perhaps even physically move the core data repository of the progenitor species from the path of the Shadow, using the immense structural integrity of their new, industrial-strength arcs. They were willing to sacrifice more ships and more resources for the preservation of this abstract, ancient knowledge than they were for the defense of their immediate home systems. Hierarch Sarth looked out at the assembled council, a mix of Cathar logic scholars, coalition diplomats, and the strangely calm, focused faces of the Terran delegation. He understood now the true meaning of the human action. They were driven by an expansive, protective instinct that transcended species and self. Their fear was the fear of a universe without answers. The Cradle of Whispers, Sarth spoke, the name echoing with the weight of myth. The purpose of the progenitors, it has always been the ultimate question. The Terrans calculated the potential for its destruction and silently mobilized their entire civilization for its defense, knowing full well that such a defense may be an extinction-level event for their own civilization. They did not ask for aid, they did not issue demands. They simply began to build the necessary defense against the erasure of history itself. He initiated the final vote. It was unanimous. The combined, unified fleet, the powerful, resilient vessels born from human fear, were deployed not to the Terran border, not to the Cathar core worlds, but toward the great, silent structure in the deep void. The mission, to use the sheer, industrialized force of their newfound survival fleet to create a sustainable, temporary pocket of stability around the cradle, long enough for the extraction and preservation of its immense, ancient knowledge core. As the first unified wave of vessels, the warships of fear, now renamed the Fleet of Constancy, began their slow, powerful acceleration toward the Rift Shadow. Hierarch Sarth stood on the bridge of the Logic Ascendant, which was now flanked by two immense, dark-hued Terran pattern vessels. He watched the deep void, realizing that the greatest lesson his ancient, logical species had learned was not a point of physics or strategy, but a fundamental truth about consciousness. The Terrans, the species they had so casually dismissed and feared for their emotional volatility, had revealed that the most potent, most ethical, and most enduring force in the cosmos was not rational superiority or overwhelming aggression. It was the deep, quiet, systematic, and protective fear of loss, the fear of a universe rendered meaningless, driving an overwhelming, disciplined commitment to the preservation of life, knowledge, and potential itself. The ancient, logical Cathar, standing beside their human allies, had finally found their true equals, a species whose fear was not a flaw but a furnace, forging the quiet, resilient strength required to defend not just themselves, but the silent, whispering history of the stars. The universe had unleashed a consuming darkness, and humanity had responded, not with a roar of aggression, but with the steady, calm, powerful hammer blows of construction, building an insurmountable bulwark of protective, reasoned fear. And in that ultimate act of cold, rational defense, the fractured, frightened galaxy found its unexpected, powerful, and deeply ethical salvation.